Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. I write fiction for fun and profit. Before we get to today's show, we have to do one thing real quick, and that's a little spot from our sponsor. Fortunately enough, our sponsor is me. Hey friends, it is Saturday. Time for Story Saturday. That's what we do around here on Saturdays each weekend. We read stories that I wrote because I like doing that and you like listening to them. And we are continuing with the stories I wrote last year through my 52 Stories in 2023 project. We are in Volume 2 right now, and we are doing... The story today is called Going Loomy in Ybor City. This is a fun fantasy adventure starring one of my favorite characters to write about, Dustin Cofield, the elf exterminator. He's a secret agent who works for Santa, or works for an agency who works for Santa, to help stave off the elfin menace because all these rogue elves who rebelled against him are now trying to screw up his game and screw up Christmas. And Dustin has to stop them. In this one, he has to do the worst thing ever. He has to go to a professional conference. No! Well, we'll see how he deals with it. Alright, we'll sit back and enjoy. I will read it to you because I wrote it. You will like it. Talk to you when the story's done. Life as a secret agent for an agency that doesn't exist, with the mission of keeping the elfin menace from interfering with the big guy's operation up at the pole, and to preserve Christmas joy for children everywhere, is not as glamorous as it sounds. But it's still pretty good. Lots of job satisfaction and autonomy of action. Really great benefit package. Not a lot of bureaucratic overhead, one of the blessings of the big guy's aversion to technology. But there are still some annoying hoops to jump through from time to time, like the annual Operations Overview Conference in Tampa, which, alas, was rearing its head in just a few days. So with no small amount of trepidation, I left the cookie-cutter niceness of the suburban town of Lockwood, where I'd been stationed the last several years, and hopped on a plane for the Sunshine State. Elves couldn't torture as horribly as this week promised to, but it was a burden I had to bear, so bear it I would. I'm Dustin Cofield, and I'm an elf exterminator. Lockwood gets pretty warm in the summer, downright hot, and it can be sticky as well. But the blast of heat and wet as I stepped out of the Tampa airport into the ground transportation section to meet my Uber felt like someone had just smacked me with a 50-pound bag of rice. The sweat began immediately, and I felt my shoulders wanting to droop from the heavy feel of the air and the sheer oppression of the temperature. I've been here before, of course, at least once a year since I started with the agency, but I never got used to it, and it took all of 5 minutes being here to make me thank my lucky stars I'd never been stationed in this place, and to yearn to get back home to Lockwood. At least there were hills in the Lockwood area, even a few legit mountains a couple hours away where I'd often gone hiking and camping during my time off. Tampa was just flat and hot and humid. I'm told it's better in the winter. Wouldn't know, I'd never been here then. Never intend to either. Still, as I got into my Uber and we set off to the hotel the agency always used for these events, I considered that, miserable as the weather was, it was pretty here. Palm trees and attractive scenery, and not just the women, the architecture wasn't bad either. Combined with no income tax and a state government that wasn't insane, I could see the appeal in an intellectual way, but I didn't need to worry about silly things like taxes, part of the agency's great benefits package, and the rest did not add up to enough to make me want to endure the swamp. The Uber was a Prius, of course. Not immaculately clean, but well enough kept up, with cloth seats instead of leather. Probably a good call for these hot Florida days. The driver was a skinny, black-haired guy wearing round, wide-rimmed shades and a white t-shirt. His hair was long, past his shoulders, and he had a broad grin on his face when I got in. Some kind of mix of hard rock and classical music was playing on his sound system, a mixture I had not heard before, and I was surprised to find that it worked. Well. "Where you in from, buddy?" he said, in an accent that said he was more from Alabama than Central Florida. "Little town in the Midwest," I replied, and he chuckled. "You a cigar man?" "No, just staying in Ybor City. Company's call, not mine." The driver chuckled again and shook his head. "You're missing out. Best cigars around come through here." Despite the shading of his glasses, I could feel his eyes moving from the road to peer at me in the rear view. "But watch your butt. Been getting rough around Ybor lately." I'd heard that, and seen the evolution of the area in 1 week snippets over the last several years as I came in for these events. But I wasn't too concerned. The agency had a good handle on security precautions, and even if it didn't, the crowd at this particular conference was not the kind of group you wanted to pick a fight with. For all sorts of reasons. I just smiled and nodded, though, and when we pulled up in front of the hotel, all 8 stories of glass and concrete that looked modern enough that the big guy would have an ulcer coming within 2 blocks of it, I gave the driver a hefty tip in cash. His grin grew to practically engulf his entire face, and he hopped out to pull my suitcase from the trunk area before I could even attempt it. I couldn't help but chuckle as he got back into his car and closed the door. But when he pulled away, my mirth faded as, instead of the faintly charred scent of exhaust, a strong puff of peppermint spilled out from where the Prius had been just moments ago. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight on end, and I looked left and right, quickly scanning the registration drop-off zone where I was standing. A bunch of adults going in and out, no one appreciably shorter than normal, no kids, so no one who could be a pointy in disguise. I was just beginning to think I'd imagined the telltale scent when my eyes alighted back on the Ybor Prius, turning to the right to exit the hotel's parking lot. A second head popped up in the front passenger seat, shorter than the driver, significantly shorter, so I couldn't make out the face well, but I could see the black hair like the driver's, and the point of an elongated ear sticking up out of that hair. I blinked, and the Prius pulled out of sight. Adrenaline surged, and I dropped the suitcase and sprinted toward the hotel's entrance. I almost knocked the auto-opening doors off their tracks, I moved so quickly. I needed to get to the security office. Now. The hotel security office was behind the front desk and down a short, blank, white-walled corridor. Normally I wouldn't just barge past the front desk, but when the agency takes over the hotel for the conference, it takes over the hotel for the conference. Unsure what arrangement the high-ups made with hotel management, or how they got the employees to not make a big deal about it, but for the week before and after the conference, all of the personnel on duty were agency people, down to the janitorial and housekeeping staff. I never did learn how you had to screw up to be assigned to those details during conference time, and I had no intention of learning. I recognized the mid-30s black guy in the red jacket of the hotel's livery behind the counter, Gamal from the branch headquarters in Seattle. Our eyes locked as he saw me racing toward his position, and his widened for a second. Then he nodded and jerked a nod toward the corridor in question, and I sped past the trio of slightly overweight civilians who were in the process of checking in. "What in the?" said the woman of the bunch as I ducked past. I didn't register Gamal's explanation of what I was doing, but I trusted it was a good one. The security office itself was small, not much bigger than a decently sized walk-in closet, but it was stocked with the latest in high-tech surveillance gear, visual and infrared, motion sensors, and peppermint sniffers in the outside grounds, audio devices in the public areas inside, everything you could want and more. A scrawny guy in a white, short-sleeved collared shirt with close-cut, dirty blonde hair was sitting in the office's lone chair in front of the stack of monitors that dominated the center of the room, and a lithely slender woman of either Chinese or Korean descent, I had never learned which, stood over his right shoulder, looking at the stack as well. She wore navy blue slacks and a loosely cut light blue blouse, and had her hands on her hips like she was about to issue an order when I pushed inside. She turned, and the scowl that had been beginning to form on her face stopped, then reversed into a warm smile as she saw me. "Agent Cofield," she said. "I always thought you'd come running back, but never thought it would happen literally." As always, the slightly yellowish tint of her otherwise dark brown eyes stood out, giving her an even more exotic look than was typical of her kinswomen. That and the way she smiled drew me up short for a second. There had been a time when we were almost but not quite an item, before I got transferred to Lockwood, and more importantly, before I met Nora. I've moved on from it, but I never was sure if she had, and statements like that were part of the reason why. But I didn't have time to worry about that right this moment. We've got a problem, Gia. She looked to be about to make another quip, but I summarized what had happened with the Prius driver, and all humor or attempt at allure left her face. She turned back to the tech at the panel. Code green, Jamie. He nodded and hit a button on the right-hand side of his panel. The conference was going into lockdown. In the hotel basement, the agency had cleared out a storage room adjacent to the laundry facility. There, they had set up a mobile command center and a bare-bones forensic lab. Nothing that would work for CSI-level analysis, but for detecting basic elfin gadgets and chicanery, it would do just fine. After an hour of agency personnel sweeping the grounds while trying to look like they weren't, to keep the normies from panicking, the conference command staff held a powwow there. Naturally, I was invited, as was my suitcase. The agent in charge was a man I'd interacted with a handful of times over the years. Mid-50s, kind of doughy about the middle, but with the shoulders and chest that said he had been a powerlifter back in his prime. Tom Johansson was based in the agency headquarters now. But when I first transferred to Lockwood, he had been a regional director for the Midwest. We'd interacted in connection with a couple of high-profile cases I worked, and he struck me as a tough and no-nonsense, but reasonable. And he could crush an entire bowling league team single-handedly. Right that moment, though, as he sat in the center of the 3-seat command table in a navy blue pinstripe suit and a red power tie, hands clasped on the tabletop in front of him like he had to restrain himself from crushing something or someone. His knuckles were white. He was gripping his own hand so hard. He definitely had the no-nonsense dial turned up to 11. He stared hard at me, standing at parade rest before the table and trying not to look over to the left, where the forensics techs were at work with my suitcase. And my underwear for the week. Their stare drew on for a long, silent count of 10. Then, Agent Cofield, would you like to explain how you got into a Prius and didn't know there was an elf in the front seat? Put that way, it sounded really bad. And it was. But still, I shrugged. I wasn't looking, to be honest, and you weren't looking. That was Gia, who sat at Tom's left. Whatever flame she might still be carrying for me, she was head of security for this conference. She had less room for nonsense in her tone or expression than Tom did. The words whipped across the room toward me, severe disapproval cutting sharp. Are you always that lax in your security precautions? I looked levelly at her. I wouldn't call it lax. What would you call it then? Routine. A routine trip, routine ride in an Uber. No indication that there was anything awry or to expect any trouble. Tom let out a snort. You were on your way to the biggest agency meeting of the year. Which happens the same week every year, in the same location every year. I shot back at him before he could finish whatever criticism he was about to level. The pointies know about it. They can't not. Even the normies know about it, just not exactly everything. I leaned forward on the balls of my feet slightly, keeping my hands clasped behind my back. So let's not pretend this is some kind of covert op. It's an excuse to get some time in the Florida sun, really. Tom blinked. So did Gia. The wind left both their sails a bit. Tom actually flushed slightly pink. To his right, the third member of the conference command staff chuckled and ran his index finger alongside the bridge of his nose in the way I'd seen the big guy do during my one trip up to the pole. But Carlos Ceveda was not what anyone would call big. He stood maybe 5'5", and if he weighed 125 pounds, I was a teenager again. But he was quick on his feet and with his fists. He was a USMC boxing champion back in the day, and had come up through the agency's ranks quickly. He was only 10 years older than me, but in charge of logistics for the entire operation. I'd always liked him because he didn't take himself too seriously and knew how to give and take jokes. But damn if he wasn't deadly with a bottle of tequila. Right now, he was looking at his two colleagues with an expression that said he thought I'd dinged them real good. And the blossoming grin on his face beneath the bushy black mustache he wore confirmed it. Calm down, Tom, Gia. Dustin's right. The other two looked back at him, resistance on both faces, but after a second, Tom and then Gia's expressions cracked. Gia rolled her eyes and made a dismissive wave of her hand as though to say, fine, whatever. Tom just leaned back in his seat and let out a breath. Finally, he nodded. Yeah. Like saying it had allowed him to regain some of his bearing, he straightened back up again. Yeah, but we still have a problem on our hands, and we need to make a decision. Do we go on with the conference, or... Now Carlos really did laugh. Do you really want to send a message that we're going to turn and tail and run just because we spot a pointy in a cab? The little guy's probably having a pint somewhere telling stories of how he got one over on the great Dustin Cofield. Carlos gestured in my direction, and won't pay for a drink until next month. He glanced back at me and winked, but I don't think there's enough to warrant panicking over. I agree, Gia said, but we definitely need to follow up. I'll get a team working the Ybor driver. He must be connected with the elves in some way. She frowned. And they must have found out Dustin's itinerary and deliberately decided to do this. The elf, whoever he was, must have been hiding in the floorboard when he got in. I nodded agreement. It was the only thing that made sense. But what was he hoping to accomplish by it? Tom glanced sidelong at Carlos and gave a quick shake of his head. Not just a prank to get some free drinks. No, certainly not, Gia said. Then she finally looked away from me and toward the forensics techs. She raised her voice a bit. Have you found anything, Justine? The older of the techs, a graying brunette who was carrying 10 or 15 extra pounds beneath her lab coat, all on her chest, looked up from where she had been staring intently at one of my socks and shook her head. Nothing, just some interesting boxer short designs. She raised her eyebrows and I rolled my eyes as Carlos laughed again. She looked like she wanted to follow suit, but she kept her face straight. We've sniffed everything. No trace of any elfin residue at all. That was odd. Very odd. I looked back at Gia, perplexed. She returned my look and after a moment shrugged. I suppose it could have just been a prank or a joyride, maybe an initiation for a new member of the local crew. I could tell Tom didn't like either of those possibilities. Neither did I. It was too simple, too informal, unprofessional, almost childish. And though the elves were small, they were not children. They had proven to be savvy and dangerous opponents over the years. If they had gone to the effort to target me specifically, they meant something by it, but what? I unclasped my hands and spread them helplessly. I don't know. Which was the simple truth. Tom sighed. Well, until we learn something more, we're going to keep security tight. Gia nodded. And I'm sorry, Dustin, but until further notice, you need to stay inside this hotel. If they are targeting you for something more than just a silly prank, I don't want you exposing yourself. Tom didn't know it, but he had just done me a big favor. Stay in the air conditioning and out of the Tampa heat wave? Don't tempt me with a good time. But I tried to make it look like I wasn't wanting to dance for joy right then. I just nodded. Yes, sir. All right. Tom drew a breath and looked from Gia to Carlos and back. They seemed to speak silently for a second, then Tom nodded again. Okay, we'll continue with the conference as planned then. First event is tomorrow at 0800. You refocused in on me. Go get settled in, but keep your eyes open, Agent Cofield. I nodded, then looked over at Justine. Make sure you roll the boxes upright when you repack all that. I'm in room 721. Send it up? Then I turned and left the room. The first 2 days of the conference went well, or as close to well as they could considering it was a conference, with nothing to do but to go to meeting after meeting to hear people pontificate about issues that weren't really problems and make suggestions that no one who actually worked in the field could possibly take seriously. But the headquarters folks tended to. So I suppose that was one good thing about it. The conference gave us working-class stiffs the chance to point out how dumb most of those new initiatives were. No guarantee they wouldn't be put into policy regardless, though. The evening of the second day, the command staff reconvened in the command center, and once again I was invited to attend. Before you ask, I said to Tom, no, I haven't seen or smelled anything that even resembles an elf anywhere. I spread my hands. I think maybe Gia was right, and it was just a prank of some sort. Tom frowned slightly, but shrugged and sat back in his chair. Gia? Gia shrugged as well. Nothing from my people either. So do we step down to a lower security protocol? Gia frowned. Can't go all the way back down to normal, but I think a reduction to level 2 could be warranted. And not a moment too soon, I really need a cigar, Carlos said. We had been at the maximum level 5 security posture on my arrival day, but stepped down to level 3 after our meeting that afternoon. The problem with level 3 is it eliminated the real reason for the conference. People could go outside, but they weren't permitted to leave the immediate vicinity of the hotel. No bar hopping, no clubs, no sampling the various cigar shops in the area. Total bummer. Or not. Gia returned Carlos's mock, pleading expression with one of mute exasperation that just made Carlos grin. Between them, Tom rolled his eyes. All right, level 2 it is, but Dustin, he pointed at me, you still have to stay on the hotel grounds. But can I go outside? Tom paused, then nodded. But only in the immediate area of the entrances. I don't want you straying too far for security to help if you need it. Roger that. I didn't bother going outside. Didn't really want to anyway. The hotel's gym had a sauna if I really wanted to sweat for no reason. Fortunately, I brought the latest Glimmervale Chronicles novel on the trip, which had come out just this last week. I wasn't sure if I would have time to read. Previous conferences I had been dragged out on various trips and meet and greets and the like, but as I was confined to the hotel, I got to watch all my colleagues go out and I just sat in one of the couches of the lobby and immersed myself in fun, swords, and sorcery for a while. And all without having to sweat like a pig. It didn't suck. I got through much more of the book than I expected, far more than I usually do in merely 1 week. By Thursday afternoon, I only had about 20 pages left, and I was beginning to think I was going to have to hit the gym a lot harder tonight and tomorrow to eat up time. Maybe I just changed my flight back from Saturday morning to Friday evening. But then Gia walked up to my couch in the lobby and took a seat in the stuffed chair adjacent to it. "How's it going, Dustin?" I shrugged. "Best conference in a while, actually." She blinked, and I had to chuckle. "I'm not a Florida fan. Too humid." She shut her mouth and cocked her head to the side, studying me for a second. "I didn't know that." "Yeah, well, no sense in bitching and moaning about it. I usually just suck it up during these conference weeks. But this time I don't have to go out at all, and it's actually nice and relaxing." "You're a strange man, Dustin. Do you know that?" "Yup, and happy to be." Gia fully laughed. Then she stood back up. "Well, I'll leave you to your book then," she said, and walked toward the rear of the lobby, which housed the hotel's trio of elevators. I watched her go, unconsciously noting the sway of her hips as I considered that encounter to have been odd. But whatever, she was maybe thinking to suggest we go do something together, and thought better of it. I hadn't mentioned Nora per se, but Gia knew we were serious. Quite serious. Maybe a flash of conscience? Or I was just being egotistical, and Gia really did find my dislike of Florida odd. Wouldn't be the first time someone had. "Ah, well," I said to myself. Then I went back to my book. The conference ended uneventfully and on schedule. I checked, but it would have been stupid pricey to change my flight at the last minute, so I decided to just leave as planned Saturday morning. So, Glimmervale 7 completed, I spent the evening sweating the way God intended, in the weight room. Gia and Tom had agreed to reduce security down to level 1, and Tom had said I could go out that night if I wanted to. But I'd gotten so used to not going out, I found I didn't miss it at all. So I waved off several colleagues' invitations to come along and just worked out. As I punished my back and thighs with deadlifts and squats, I thought back to that Ybor ride on Sunday afternoon. What had that elf been up to? "Had to be a prank," I muttered as I lowered my 5th deadlift of the set back down to the floor. It felt like a cop-out, but really, what else could it have been at this point? No follow-up from the pointy at all, not even a failed attempt. Nothing all week. A prank still felt wrong, though, somehow. Maybe it was a training mission, like a graduation test in skulking or something, but that rang hollow also. Still, by the time I hit the rack that night, I couldn't think of any other explanations for what that pointy had been doing, hiding in my cab. I got up early for my flight and was down out front of the hotel as the sun was just lifting above the eastern horizon. A Prius pulled into the driveway and I blinked. I looked down at the Ybor app and sure enough, that was the car I was waiting for. The same car as from Sunday. Same driver. "What the hell?" I said softly. The Prius pulled to a halt in front of me and the driver opened his door and got out. Same guy. Same long black hair and broad grin. "We meet again, Dustin. How you been, brother?" I just stared at him for a long count of 5 before answering. "Do you often get repeat customers?" He shrugs. "It happens sometimes. I once gave a ride to the same woman 3 days in a row." His grin became a bit more lascivious. "She gave me her number at the end of the ride number 3. He popped open his trunk. I stepped over to the car, hefting my suitcase to put it inside. "How'd that work out for you?" The driver shrugged. "Dated her a couple months, but she went psycho on me." "Shocker." The driver went back to his door, and I followed on the passenger side. "Mind if I take shotgun this time? I had a late night last night, and I sometimes get car sick in the back seat when that happens." The driver hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Your call, brother. Long as you don't pull a knife, I mean." He waggled his eyebrows to show he wasn't serious, but I got the impression he hadn't entirely been kidding around about that either. I half expected a pointy to jump out when I opened the front door, but no, the floorboard was empty, as was the back seat and its floorboards. I'd checked as I walked past. I settled down into my seat and the driver put the car into gear, then pulled out of the parking lot. I considered confronting him about the elf from Sunday, but decided discretion was the better part of valor, for the moment at least. so instead I rode in silence and watched the buildings and landscape scroll past my window. I hadn't entirely been dishonest with the driver. I had been up fairly late last night, but lifting, not drinking. Still, despite being on my guard with him, I found myself lulled by the ride and the admittedly beautiful scenery outside. It took me about 15 seconds to realize we missed the turn to the expressway that would bring us to the airport. Hey, weren't we supposed to turn back there? The driver shook his head. There's construction a half-mile down. If we go this way, we can get on after it and avoid the backup. That made sense, except this was 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. How was there a backup at this hour, even with construction? The car was rounding a bend in the road. Then all of a sudden the driver slammed on the brakes as a black SUV pulled out from nowhere ahead of us and stopped, perpendicular to the lane so that it blocked the road almost completely. I had my seatbelt on, but still I was pressed forward and had to throw my hands up onto the dashboard to brace myself. What the hell? I said. You're boxed in, the driver said, looking in the rear view. I turned my head, and my jaw dropped open. There was another black SUV there as well. Where had they come from? And wait, the driver said I was boxed in. I was just pressing my seatbelt release when my door opened, and a high-pitched, but deeper than most elves, voice said, "We meet again, Cofield." They had the drop on me, so I moved slowly, turning right in my seat to address my kidnapper? Whatever this was. The elf was short, of course, but impeccably dressed in a three-piece navy blue pinstripe suit with a white and blue power tie. His hair was black and drawn back into a ponytail at the nape of his neck, exposing the elongated, pointy ears for all to see, and he wore gold-rimmed spectacles. He was standing just outside the swing of my car door, and I recognized him immediately. "Loomy," I said. He nodded. "You remember this time, huh?" Well, the last time was a bit more memorable than hunting down stolen teddy bears. That wasn't me, and you know it. He stepped back and swung his left hand, indicating I should step toward the rear of the car. "Get out." Continuing to move slow, I complied, and saw that men, normal grown men, Cuban from the look of them, had exited from both SUVs. 2 were standing at the front of the Prius, and 2 were at the rear. One of each pair carried a shotgun, the other a pistol. This wasn't good at all. "How's Nora?" Loomy asked as I came to a halt even with the Prius's rear bumper. A surge of anger flooded my system at memories of the last time he and I met, when he kidnapped Nora to try to get me to steal some evidence from our forensics units for him. Evidence that contained computer code for the elves' own naughty and nice lists. I had pretended to comply, but instead given him the evidence laced with a computer virus that would wipe out all of their efforts. The case had been the one that set the agency to wondering if the elves' long-time inability to use electronics and technology was still holding fast, or if they'd found a way around that limitation. I suspected they had, but hadn't been able to prove it. But now, clearly, they had intercepted me a second time. They had to have accessed the Ybor app somehow to do that. It all but confirmed that my suspicion was true. Which should have made me concerned. But his daring to speak Nora's name made me mad enough that I couldn't go there just yet. I couldn't let him see I was angry, though, so as I turned to face him, I put on my best fake smile. "She's doing great, actually. How's your mom?" Loomy's brow furrowed at the return jab. He had claimed that his mom was dead and left him that evidence that he wanted me to steal. No way to know if that was true or not, but it didn't matter, did it? "Pop the trunk, Ted," he said, glancing at the driver, who nodded. In a moment the guy at the rear with the pistol had the trunk open, and he pulled out my suitcase and brought it over to Loomy. "I got a score to settle with you for the last time," Loomy said. "Oh, come on. All's fair in love and war, you know that. You made your play, I made mine. I won, you lost. And now it's your turn." Loomy's eyebrows raised. "I ruined your vacation in the sun, forced you to stay cooped up in that cruddy hotel all week when you could have been out living the good life." Was that what he thought? I snorted out a laugh. "Loomy, I hate Florida. I should thank you for giving me an excuse to just stay in the air conditioning all week." He blinked, then shrugged. "Whatever, that was an added bonus," but he trailed off, then bent over, popping my suitcase. He dug around inside it for a moment, then straightened, holding up Glimmervale 7 in his left hand, victoriously. "This," he said, "this is where you lose." "What, the book? Take it. I've already finished it. It's really good, but you should know that Melanie dies at the end." He glowered at me for a second. "I don't know who Melanie is, and I don't care." He reached into his pocket with his right hand and pulled out a small folding knife, which he jabbed into the bottom of the book's spine. I winced at the wound. That was just mean. After a moment's digging around with his knife, Loomy had the spine practically cut off the book, going 1/3 up its length. He held it up to peer at it, then pursed his lips and nodded in satisfaction. He refolded his knife and pocketed it, then dug his fingers into the slaughtered book spine. A moment later, he pulled out a long black sliver of something. Smiling, he held it up for me to see. Know what this is? I shrugged. This is the bug you've been carrying around all week, during your entire conference. Every meeting, every conversation, every word said in every room you've been in, recorded. I blinked, ice water flooding my veins as the weight of his words hit me. I'd brought that book with me. I usually did on conferences, tucked away inside my other things, just in case things became completely insufferable. I'd never actually gotten around to reading in any of the meetings, probably wouldn't have for real even if there had been the opportunity, because I can be a smart aleck, but there's also such a thing as taking things too far. But the book had been with me, which meant I swallowed but didn't reply. I didn't really trust myself to speak right then. I had people tailing you back in Lockwood, and they slipped this in the night before you left. But it has to be turned on, and the control transmitter is really short range. I nodded slowly. So you hid in Ted's floorboard to turn the bug on yourself. Why? Loomy shrugged. It was kind of fun. Besides, I won't have to buy a drink for months. Just have to tell people how I got one over on the great Dustin Cofield, even sat right under his nose and he didn't know it. The echo of Gia's words from the other day irked me, but I let it slide. I looked from Loomy to the pistol wielder next to me and back again. Well, I guess you win this one, Loomy. Well played. He nodded. Thank you. Silence loomed for several seconds, then I cleared my throat. Okay. Now what? Loomy gestured toward the pistol wielder, and he turned to face me, holding out his left hand. Now you give Pedro your cell phone. Pedro didn't have his pistol pointing at me. It was down by his right hip. But his partner behind me had his shotgun, and the two guys up forward had their weapons. Only weapon I had was my sharp wit at this point. So I gave him my cell phone. Pedro looked at it for a breath. Then he threw it onto the pavement at his feet full force. I almost felt the glass of its face shatter, the sound was so clear. Then Pedro stomped on it. Once. Twice. A third time. Ground it into the pavement beneath his heels so hard that it was well and truly a broken piece of plastic and metal when he was through with it. Sorry about that, Loomy said. He bent back over and closed my suitcase back up, then nodded to Pedro. The pistolero moved to Loomy's side and holstered his weapon. Then he picked up my suitcase in his right hand. He paused, then spun and twisted, and flung the suitcase over the berm alongside the road. It sailed up and seemed to hover in the sky for a second. Then it fell out of sight behind the berm, and I heard a splash. I groaned. Of course. The road ran alongside one of the many waterways draining into Tampa Bay. I gave Loomy a hard look that seemed to slide off him. He shrugged again. Sorry, he didn't sound like it. Anyway, have a nice day, Cofield. I've got a plane to catch. With that, he slipped into the shotgun seat that I had vacated not so long ago. Ted closed his trunk and got back into the driver's seat, not looking at me the whole way. The car started up, and Loomy turned to grin at me. Thanks for the ride, he said. Then he closed the passenger door. Pedro had left my side and gone back to his SUV, as had his partner. The two gunmen from the front of the car did the same. In short order, all three cars peeled away, leaving me standing there on the side of the road, shattered cell phone at my feet, while my suitcase was no doubt slowly sinking into the water of Tampa Bay on the other side of the berm. Son of a bitch, I said. Well, he really boned you hard, Carlos said. We sat at the hotel bar. I was nursing a beer. Only a beer. In the hour and a half since I managed to get back to the hotel and had reported what had happened to the command staff, he had tried 5 times to get me to a tequila shot. But I wasn't going there. Not with him, at least. I'd ended up under too many tables while he laughed at me, apparently still completely sober, and endured too many hellish mornings after to fall for that old trick again. Yeah, he did, I said, and I took a long swallow. I mean, he even took your seat on the plane. Carlos said it with what sounded almost like admiration. And it was true. Somehow, no idea how, Loomy had used my booking to get on the plane for St. Louis. I couldn't have made the flight anyway, not after how he had left me there on the road, but that extra act twisted the knife something fierce. Yeah, he did, I said in as dull and wooden a tone as I could. Otherwise, I might snap back at Carlos, and he wasn't trying to be a jerk. After a moment, he reached out and gave my shoulder a squeeze. Hey man, we can't win 'em all. Look at it this way. We didn't really cover anything too terribly sensitive this week. Damage is minimal, really. I looked sidelong at him, and he obviously was being sincere. Just a friend, or a friendly colleague at least, trying to cheer a fellow up. And I appreciated that, but it still stung. So I just took another long drink, drained the entire glass. Then I flagged down the bartender for a refill. He took up the glass and began to turn. "Wait," I said, and he stopped. His name was Hank, I think, a relatively new recruit to the agency, just come out of the NYPD if I remembered right. Hank raised an eyebrow at me. I sighed, then looked back at Carlos for a second. I sighed again. "Tequila, Hank." Carlos blinked, and even Hank looked surprised. I nodded. "Tequila. And leave the bottle. Because screw it. I'd get back at Loomy later. For now, I just needed to drown my sorrows." Well, like Sam Elliott said in The Big Lebowski, sometimes you get the bar and sometimes the bar gets you, right? And, well, poor Dustin, but hey, you know, like the guy said, you can't win them all. On the bright side, though, hey, we got to see Loomy again. Loomy's fun, sort of. It's always good to have nemesis show back up, and yeah, recurring bad guy characters are fun. So we might or might not hear from Loomy again in the future. I will let you read and find out about that. But there definitely is going to be more visits to good old Dustin in the future, because I like writing about him. And hopefully you guys like hearing about him and reading about him, because he's cool. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed that. Next week, we are going to continue with Volume 2 from last year, and it is a story called The Corvus Bridge. This is a story set in my sci-fi universe featuring the Icaran Confederation Navy, which, interestingly enough, as you saw from the little ad spot at the beginning of this video, we are currently doing a Kickstarter campaign for an Icaran Confederation Navy novel called Warfare Qualified. Been working on this for years, and it's at the point where it's like, all right, need to finish it up, need to get her done. It's just about ready to go. Let's show it to the world, get some money going, and get people interested, and so we can launch it right. And so that's why we're doing the campaign. The campaign has been crushing so far, and I fully expect / hope, knock on wood, that it will continue to crush. I always set the initial campaign goals fairly low so I can be sure I hit them, but we're blowing it out of the water so far, so that's great. So if you haven't checked out that campaign yet, go to michaelkingswood.com/ICNkick, and that will get you to the campaign page. Right now, that's probably the best way to support me, short of just going and buying a lot of books. Now, if you want to go buy a lot of books, go to michaelkingswood.com/store. That leads you to my business store, the store that I control, that I get the most profit from. Yeah, I write good. Talk good too, apparently. But go there. Most profit for me. If you like Amazon or Barnes & Noble or iBooks or all the rest, you can find my stuff there too. Go to michaelkingswood.com/books to read the number 2. That will get you to the Universal Book Link aggregator that will get you to whatever store you want with whatever title you want. Again, I am now paralleling these Story Saturday stories on Substack, michaelkingswood.substack.com. If you prefer to read them, you can go there and read them. You should subscribe anyway, because they're there anyway, because if paralleling these stories, but also giving extra stories to people who support me there, or who support me on Subscribestar. Subscribestar.com/Michael-Kingswood. Yeah, that's good stuff. So that's all the ways you can support. Of course, the other thing you can do is like and subscribe to all your friends. But definitely come back next week. We are going to have fun with the Corvus Bridge, and we are also probably going to do some more music reaction stuff, because there's a couple songs I've found that's like, oh, from bands I like that I didn't know they had put out new songs. It's like, oh, great, get to do some of that again, because that's always fun. But there's no schedule for that. What else is going on? I think that's about it. So, hey, thanks for tuning in. Glad to see you guys here. I will catch you next week. Until then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.